So this is the mixing template that I made for Reaper. I released the first version of the mixing template a few months ago, but I did some revisions and I'm going to re-release the new version. So each group has its own VCA, and they're arranged this way. Each VCA is actually a group, but the track inside the folder, so to speak, is hidden. So that's how I got them arranged like that. It's a really good way of organizing the folders. All you have to do is enable group folders to left and group tracks that have receives to left, and then you can get yourself all of your folders over to one side, and if you arrange them correctly, you can have the VCAs right beside each group, but I'm kind of digressing. So anyway, I'll just go through group by group. So each group has its VCA, and the VCA basically allows you to control the volume of the group without affecting any of the sends or receives, because if you just use the master folder right here, what'll happen is that all of your sends will still be sending and all of your receiving tracks will still be playing. But if you use a VCA, you don't have that issue. So each group has its own dedicated VCA track, and you can throw extra VCA tracks in here if you want. Like, it's really common to have a VCA for the snare, so you can throw one in there so you can control the snare a little better. I have a master VCA track just because I would rather have it this way than have the actual master track for this theme, because this theme's master track is actually kind of poorly laid out, but that's okay. If you just do a master VCA track and just have it a master to all of them, you can actually use it the same way you'd use the master track, and you can write your global automation that way, and it's actually it's really useful. So okay, the first group is drums. The drums have a compressor set up for the standard bus compression for drums, or drum compression, or at least what I understand to be the standard configuration. And the parameter here is just a threshold. I don't know how blurry it is in the screen capture, but there's a threshold right here, so really all you have to do is just adjust this little knob right here. If you want to go in and adjust some parameters, you can, but these are pretty standard parameters, I would imagine, for drum compression. The drums are also sending to a parallel compression receive. Next would be the kick drum. The kick drum is sending to the bass through channels 3 and 4, and the bass is receiving them through recomp right here, and it's set up for peak. It's set up for peak reduction, or at least that style of compression, with a pretty aggressive ratio of 5 to 1. And I also have a threshold parameter set up here, so that all you have to do is just dip the threshold until the bass noticeably ducks out of the kick drum's way, and then you just adjust it so that the kick and the bass lock up super tight together, and the bass is sufficiently ducked without there being any noticeable pumping or breathing. And if there is noticeable pumping or breathing, it's probably because the release is not set correctly. Kick drums, in my experience, for the release, the decay of the kick drum transient is anywhere between 15 and like 50 milliseconds for like a recorded kick. If you're doing like EDM, then you can have kicks that are like a second long or 2 seconds long, but for a recorded kick, the actual meat of the transient is going to be about 15 to 50 milliseconds. So you can set that release however you want if you hear any pumping or breathing. But that's for the ducker, just to duck the bass whenever the kick is hit. I definitely prefer that most of the times, like most of the time, to making like harsh EQ cuts to the low end of the bass in order to make the kick and the bass work well together. I prefer just to duck the bass and try to retain as much tonal quality from both instruments as possible. It's just a stylistic choice. You can do it however the hell you want. Moving on to the snare is going to parallel compression, excitation, and reverb. Reverb is probably, I mean, it is very, very common on snare, so that's why I have it. Excitation, not everybody does parallel excitation on their snare. I do it because I really like having some extra air in the high end on the snare. I think it just makes it crack even harder. There are a couple free plugins that you can throw on there that are really good. Roth Air, I believe it's called. is one that you can throw on there, and it's really good for adding air to the high end of the snare. You could also add, like, I can't remember what it's called, like La Petite Excite, which is not actually an exciter. It's just a low boost and a high boost. But anyway, you can have parallel excitation if you want. Parallel compression with the snare. You can also put saturation on this receiving track if you want, like a hot, heavily compressed snare in the background with a really, really crazy extended tail. You can do that as well and tuck it underneath with this send right here. So that's the rationale behind that. The timer bus. The timer bus is just where I throw any timekeeping cymbals that are going to be mic'd separately. So like something like a hi-hat or a ride or a china or a secondary hi-hat. Those are the types of things that would go in the timer bus. And I have a filter. It's just a high-pass filter at 1,000 hertz. And I have a parameter that you can adjust. So if you have really dark cymbals, you can adjust this down. If you have really bright cymbals and you think you can afford to cut out a little bit more kick and snare garbage, you can dial that up either way. I'll go over the tom section. There is method to my madness here, each tom having its own bus. And I'll get to that a little bit later. But each one of these is being sent to a room reverb. I like to have reverb for some of the drum kit and then other reverbs for other parts of the drum kit. So almost never put reverb on the kick, and if I do, I'm going to filter the kick high and low so only the high end has the reverb. But that's a different story. That's a really, really weird technique. But the snare, I like to have a different reverb, and the entire rest of the kit I like to have sometimes another reverb. And each one of these toms is going to a parallel compression track. And again, you can add saturation. You can crush the living hell out of it to extend the tail out even further. And you can tuck it underneath. And it's a really good way of getting really, really beefy toms, is using parallel compression on every single one individually. I really enjoy that. On the overhead bus, I have another filter at 1,000 hertz. Again, if you have really dark cymbals, dial it down. If you have really bright cymbals, dial it up. But 1,000 hertz is generally more or less where the low end of the cymbals is going to start to peter off, and you generally don't hear cymbals below 1,000 hertz. So that's my rationale. That's my rationale behind that. For the room bus, pretty much my rationale here is I want to have mid-side control. Because I do like really mono room mics or room tracks, but sometimes they have a tendency, especially if they're very, very loud and and there's a lot of presence there, like it's just a gigantic sounding track. And some room mics for drum kits are like that. Sometimes it can have a tendency to crush the whole kit back down to mono. So if you mute the room bus and listen to the drum kit without the room, it could sound super wide and really good, and then all of a sudden you bring the room bus back into the mix and it crushes everything back down to mono, and that's really not good. And even though I really like the kick and snare reinforcement that the room tracks get you, sometimes you still want a little bit less mid. So what I've done here is I've set up a mid-side encoder and decoder going through Recomp. If you want to just compress the mids, you just get rid of the right channel. And if you want to just compress the sides, you get rid of the left channel. Right now it's set to compress everything. So if you want to compress the mid and then tuck it down a little bit, you can do it this way. Or I have another parameter here that is taking the center level from the mid-side decoder. And what that does is it just lets you bring the center down in level without compressing it necessarily. And what that can do is, if your room mics are crushing you down to mono super hard, what you can actually do is just bring the center down and try to get some of that space back without compromising too much of that kick and snare reinforcement. So that's the drum bus, the entire drum bus, or drum group rather, I should say. I have a bus for extra percussion. It has things like tambo, shaker, conga, bongos. I recently mixed a punk band, or a punk sludge metal band, and they had a a gong. So that's kind of strange, but you never know what kind of extra percussion you're going to have. So there's a separate bus for it with another filter at 1,000 hertz. Bass track, I went over the bass track and the kick ducking and the routing for recomp. I have a bass DI bus and a bass amp bus because sometimes you want both. Sometimes you choose just the DI track, sometimes you choose just the amp tracks, but sometimes I mix and match them. Sometimes I filter the high end of the DI track with the low end of the amp track and mix them together because maybe they have sonic characteristics that are good, but maybe the low end of the DI track is, you know, not as good as the low end on the amp track, but the high end of the amp track is not as good as the high end on the DI track, you know, so you can blend them and mix and match them and do whatever you want, and I fully set you up just for that thing, just for that technique or that method. Oh god, I shouldn't have smoked that. Okay, so the first guitar bus here in the guitar group is it's the rhythm track. So I put this here with the rationale that these are going to be pretty heavily distorted. And if they're heavily distorted, there's actually a really fucking cool technique that you can do. They're being sent to a receiving track called the guitar phase. And I'll just go over there really quick just to show you. So guitar phase. So right here. So what's happening is I put time adjustment on here, which is a JS plugin. And I'm delaying the sent signal by about 10 samples. Between, like, I would say 3 and 10 samples, you can create just enough phase cancellation that you can actually help drums become more not louder, but more present in the mix. There's more room for the drums. And I'm not making this up. This is actually a technique that's been used. You sacrifice a little bit, just a tiny bit of body for the guitars. So the guitars will sound slightly thinner, but the drums sound absolutely huge. Typically this is done, or traditionally it's done, by having close mics complemented by distance mics, and it creates a natural phase discrepancy or phase cancellation. Creates little pockets all along the frequency spectrum where the drums can live. And like I said, it just makes the guitars, you know, sometimes inaudibly thinner, you know, but you get a lot back for the drums. You get a lot of space for the drums. And if you don't believe me that, you know, the thinner guitars for bigger drums trade-off, if you don't believe me about that trade-off, you can go and listen to Rage Against the Machine's self-titled album. The guitars are not very heavy. The guitars are obviously heavily distorted, but they're thin, and they're thin for a reason. There's phase cancellation in those guitars because they were close and distance mic'd, and when you do that, you create these little canceled out pockets all over the frequency spectrum, and they make they just give more room. They give more real estate to the drums, and naturally any other instrument, but it's most noticeable with drums. So get some heavily distorted, like, death metal guitars, put them on that bus, or like put them in the tracks, and then dial in this guitar phase receive and start playing around with the sample, with the sample delay at the bottom here, right here. Start playing around with it, just a few samples, you know, more or less, just to kind of create enough phase cancellation. Just have some drums playing behind them and just listen to it open up. You know, there will be times where the guitars will get super thin. You're like, oh, that sounds like shit, obviously. But there is a sweet spot where you can get the most out of the drums without losing a whole hell of the guitars. So that's my rationale behind that. And that's probably the most strange kind of esoteric thing in here, I guess you could say. The lead bus, I think it just has some reverb and delay. So your lead tracks for reverb and delay, and it has a filter which is more or less just to kill the DC offset, which is very, very, very common with all guitars that have been recorded through like an amp and like 10 stomp boxes or whatever. Like that low end garbage, that interference builds up over time, right? So I have DC offset filters on all of the guitar tracks. Now, you can argue with me about whether or not they're necessary, but they're there, and it's my template, so there's your answer. The guitar verb is, I think it's on every single guitar track, and I have different reverbs for the solo, because I think, you can have really short reverbs for like lead tracks or whatever, but sometimes you want an extended reverb or a longer reverb for a solo, or the other way around. So the solos get their own reverb and their own delay. And I won't talk about guitars too much. In fact, I think I'm pretty close to done talking about the buses, because there isn't really a whole lot left to talk about. I have the same kind of mid-side setup that I had for the room bus, but I have it on the piano because in my experience, especially recording things like apartment pianos, you almost mic them like overheads. You have left and right. You have your bass keys on one side, treble keys on the other, and la da 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 da. The only problem is that sometimes they can feel too mono, so I have some mid-side parameters here to adjust the stereo width of the piano. If you want the piano pan dead center, well, that means that you would have bass on one side and you'd have treble keys on the other side. And if you want to create space in the middle, you can adjust those parameters here. All of the keys stuff, everything for the keys group here, they're all going to parallel compression tracks and reverb tracks. They all get the same reverb track, and they all get the same parallel compression track. Because it's assumed that you probably won't use more than one at a time, right? Like, to have a piano and a Rhodes on the same song as well as synth, like, that's, in my experience, it's pretty uncommon. So the idea is that you're probably not going to use like the Rhodes and the synth, so just get rid of them, right? And then that parallel compression track can be, just for the piano. But I'm digressing again because I smoke too much. So I have strings, brass, and woodwinds. Same configuration more or less as the keys, but I call it the assemble. Just pretty self-explanatory. And then I have the group for vocals, and I have it broken up into lead bus, and then your dubs, so your double take or your double tracks. They can either be mixed separately or you can dump them into the lead bus. It depends on how the double tracks were actually recorded. If they're meant to lock up super tight, you can probably get away with mixing them both on the bus at the same time. If the double track, if you're recording like death metal and you have like a high scream and a low scream, and that's the way you did the double tracks, well, yeah, you probably want to mix them separately and then blend them together, and maybe mix them separately on the tracks and then do some overall kind of gluing on the bus. You could do it that way. I have a backups, so any backup track. So in the context of like rock, I guess. Any backup vocals that you wouldn't necessarily consider harmonies, I would put there, like any ad-lib stuff that comes in. And then there's harmonies, which are, specifically designed to be harmonies to the lead track. And the reason I do it that way is because you want to mix those separately, especially with EQ. Like, you want to filter harmonies separately. Usually, you want to filter them in a very different way, because you don't want to just crowd up the space with a whole bunch of fully open vocal tracks. To me, that it can sound cluttered over time. So what I usually do with harmonies, and it's different between male singers and female singers, but what I usually do with harmonies is filter them so that only a certain portion of them get through. And the reason I do it that way, and I don't always do it that way, but the reason I more often than not do it that way is because I don't want the harmonies to sound like other voices in the mix. I want them to sound like part of the lead vocal, but they're making the lead vocal sound like they're doing something superhuman. That's the idea, right? That when I think of harmonies, that's the idea that I'm thinking of. So if you think about guitar harmonies, for example, it shouldn't sound like 3 or 4 guitars all playing at the same time. It should sound like one guitar doing something that a guitar should never be able to do, right? It's supposed to sell an illusion, and you can only do that by mixing the harmonies separately in a different way than the rest of the vocals. If you're mixing like metalcore, I have a gang bus, so you can have your gang chants and gang shouts and things like that. That's my rationale behind that. So all of the sends, the lead has a parallel compression, it has excitation, because getting some extra air on vocals can sound really, really nice, and doing that with parallel processing actually gets really good results that are very, very easy to control, and that's why I do that. And I high pass filter after the exciter. Right, so I put the exciter on, let it use all of the information so it can generate all of the unique harmonics, and then I filter it, just to get as much information as possible. That makes sense to me, and I'm guessing that probably makes sense to you as well. The lead, the lead tracks have their own reverb, and they have their own delay, and that's true of the doubles as well. I don't have extra parallel compression for the double tracks, because honestly, you could also send those to the parallel compression for the lead track more often than not, because all you're doing is just crushing the living shit out of it anyway. And then it's all self-explanatory from here on out. I have a separate reverb for the backing vocals, separate delay for the backing vocals, separate reverb for harmonies, separate reverb for delay, and then the same delay as the backing tracks for the gang vocals. And you don't need to do it this way. You can do it whatever you want. You can do it however you want. And I have just a filter at 100 hertz on all of the tracks. Right? You can disable those and get rid of them if you want. I have filters on every single one of the aux tracks, and that's just for filtering extremely low end garbage that might creep in. Because if you're layering up a lot of reverbs and delays and all sorts of effects like that, you can very easily get a lot of low end garbage. So I have just some filters here that they're set pretty modestly. They're not going to be cutting out a whole lot. They're almost just for DC offset, I suppose. I have the receiving tracks. Like I said, there are exciters on all of the parallel excitation tracks. There's recomps set up for parallel compression on all of the parallel compression tracks. There are shelf EQs on almost every single one of them, because anytime you compress the living hell out of something for parallel compression, the mid gets accentuated and you lose a little bit of bass and you lose a little bit of treble, or at least that has been my experience. So I have, I guess you could say, custom tailored shelf EQs on every single one of them that are shelving out different frequency ranges depending on the material that's being processed. On the delay tracks is different. I actually have just a high pass and a low pass filter, just letting through one little chunk of the spectrum for the delay, because you don't want a delay taking up too much in the high range. Usually that doesn't sound very good, and filtering in that way is actually a pretty common technique, as far as I understand. So there isn't too much else for the receives. They're all pretty self-explanatory. The reason they're all muted, by the way, and with their faders down, is because I just leave all of the sends enabled, right? So instead of just enabling one of the sends and having the receiving track at full blast and all of a sudden just doubling up my amplitude for absolutely no reason, what I do is I just leave them constantly engaged, and then as I need my receives, I just unmute them and bring the volume up, right? That seems way easier. I'm sure in terms of actual like keystrokes and actions, it's actually not terribly easy by comparison. It's probably just as easy, but it seems to me this is just more comfortable for me to work with, just to be able to go, unmute, raise the volume. It works for me. You don't have to do it this way. You can do it a different way. Okay, so all of the tracks that are on all of these buses And I probably won't spend too much time because most of them are extremely self-explanatory, but there are a few that I will go over. I have these configured the way I mix drums. And a little bit of this idea is applied to the bass as well. This is the way I mix drums. I have the snare top track is doubled. So I have one copy of the track and then another copy of the track. The low copy that one copy of the track is filtered low, right? The other copy of the track is filtered high. And the reason I do that is to separate the sustain from the attack, right? I separate the sustain from the attack so that I can gate the high end to cut out cymbal bleed. This is the way I was taught how to mix drums. And it's the way I've pretty much always mixed drums. And it's amazing. And you should try it. It's really, really good. Alternatively, you can use like a multi-band gate. I think one comes with like Ozone 6 and below, like all of the isotope ozone stuff. 6 and below comes with a multi-band gate. There's also a free multi-band gate that you can use for this exact purpose, filtering the high and low and just opening up the gate on the high end to just get the attack, but none of the cymbal bleed. There's a free one. It's called SEGX2 gate by, it says Stidge T on here, but I think it's actually by Sonic Anomaly. Yeah. And it basically allows you to make a cutoff point here. I would put it at around 1000 hertz-ish. And you can actually set the threshold for high and low individually and then just set it to gate. And it's basically doing what I'm doing with these two tracks right here, but I have more control with these two tracks the way I have it set up. So I'm doing it with the top of the snare, separate the low end sustain from the high end crack, cut out the cymbal bleed. And I'm doing that exact same thing on all of my toms as well, separating the attack from the sustain so that I can cut out the cymbal bleed on every single one of them. And I also have a Reasamplomatic for samples on every single tom. And this is why they're all on separate folders. This is why they're all on separate buses, like I was mentioning earlier. It's because I filter them high and low, every single one of them. Because to me, this is the best way to do it. And with the gate, I have the gate's detector set below 1000 hertz so that the cymbals don't accidentally trip the gate. So you put the gate on first and then you filter it. Genius, right? So that's the toms. I do the same thing with the bass. The bass is filtered high and low. So you got your low filter right here for the bass. You got your high filter. And then you have a compression and set for pretty slow release so you can fatten up the low end of the bass. And then the high end is set for peak compression or peak reduction so that you can actually control the swank of the bass and the clatter and the string clatter. You can keep all that under control. And when you mix the bass this way, you get an incredibly interesting result because you can control exactly what the bass sounds like. The high end and the low end are two completely different things with bass. The high end is just like a lot of clatter, a lot of articulation, and the low end is a constant throb. And those two things are very different, but they sound very, very good together. That's why, you know, bass is pleasing to listen to. But the thing about it is that you don't get any more control than the amount of control that you get with what I'm doing right here in terms of separating the sustain of the notes from the clatter of the notes, you know, the attack of the notes. To me, this is the best way that I've come up with to do the bass. If anybody has a better way, I'm definitely open to having my mind changed. There's also a soft clipper slash limiter on them, just in case you want to get the waveform even more sausage-like. You can clamp down on the bass just a little bit, but don't go overboard because you're going to distort it, especially on the low end. But that's just there to get a little bit tighter. Also DC offset filters on all of the vocals. So okay, that's the entire template. There's a lot more to talk about. Like I could talk about how everything's grouped together. The grouping matrix was It's not very complicated. It's pretty modest. All of the VCA tracks are all set up correctly. I have the master VCA right here. It's pretty interesting. So the whole thing's together. Whole thing works. The way I set up my my tracks is that all of the buses are colored the same. All of the groups are colored the same. All of the actual tracks are colored the same. Everything is, they're all basically color coded by group or function rather. And what happens is I can actually organize them by what they are because they're color coded. So I just click on, you know, the little color right here, and I can put all of my buses right there, you know, on my track manager. I can put all of my groups right here. I can put all of my tracks. They just all line up exactly right, and I can control which ones are being shown, which ones are muted, which ones are are armed to record, which ones I can lock them on the fly right here. I don't have to dick around with this. I don't have to dick around with resizing in order to get these options right here. I can just go right here and lock the track, right? So that's the way I have my track manager set up. My master track is set up with a mid-side encoder. And the mid-side encoder is more or less just for the sub mono. So I have this set to just affect the sides, and then I'm doing a high pass at 90 Hertz. And that's to mono the bass of the track, essentially. There are different plugins that you can get to collapse the sides down to mono past a certain range instead of just doing a high pass, but I don't have such a plugin. I know they do exist. I think Bose Digital Lab makes one, but it's relatively cheap, I believe. But this is the way I'm choosing to do it, and it seems to work. I have a little bit of a boost to the highs and the lows. This was an idea that I got from Andrew Schweppes, I believe is his name. He said, you know, just add like 3 dB to 100 Hertz and add 3 dB to 1000 Hertz on your shelves, and mix with that, because it'll actually save you a lot of time with high-end and low-end boosts as you're mixing if you just apply those high-end and low-end boosts globally, right? So that made a lot of sense to me, so I've been doing that ever since. And you don't have to. You can totally throw that in the garbage if you think it's a terrible idea. And I also have another compressor here set up for what I understand to be pretty common bus compression parameters here. And I have the threshold and the sub mono, so that you can adjust them on the fly right here. Say if you want to cut out a little bit more bass from the sides, you can just dial this up. If you want to ease up on it a little bit, you can, you know, dial it down. The threshold, basically just dial it down until it sounds right. And yeah, that's the mixing template. And I hope you didn't find this video too boring. But yeah, that's it.